How does an entire nation slowly hand its soul over to one man? Welcome to a deep exploration into the darkest corners of human group psychology. In this explainer, we're not just going to rattle off historical dates and battles. Instead, we're going to unpack the terrifying step-by-step mechanics of how an ordinary, modern society can totally collapse into unimaginable darkness. We're looking at the psychological warfare, the mass manipulation, and that quiet, creeping moral decay that allows monsters to literally take the reins of a nation. So, let's dive right in.
We really have to shatter our own comfort here by asking what is arguably the most unsettling question of modern history. How do ordinary, totally rational people become complicit in catastrophic evil, often without even realizing it until it's too late? How does hatred just become normal? To figure this out, we have to trace the anatomy of a societal collapse and look at the psychological descent of a population that was, for all intents and purposes, systematically hypnotized.
And the incubation of this evil starts in a place you might not expect: Vienna, 1913. To truly understand this collapse, we have to rewind to 1913 Vienna. It's a city of just wild, jarring contrasts. On one hand, you've got this vibrant cultural soup of brilliant minds. Intellectuals like Sigmund Freud are sitting in local coffee houses, unlocking the secrets of the human psyche. But on the exact same streets, you have the bleak, pathetic reality of a young Adolf Hitler. He's a destitute, resentful dropout who's been rejected not once, but twice by the Academy of Fine Arts. He's living in a slum, a literal doss house near the Danube. And witnesses from that time actually recall him just shredding the air with these unhinged, operatic rants about racial purity to anyone in the shelter who would listen. He was a nobody.
And it's absolutely crucial to remember that in these early days, he was widely laughed at. Even a full decade later in 1923, after his totally botched armed treason during the Beer Hall Putsch, where he literally burst in with his paramilitaries to start a revolution, he was arrested, thrown in prison, and completely dismissed by the mainstream. People saw him as a powerless, fanatical joke, but here is a truly terrifying truth about human nature. A joke stops being funny when the audience is starving.
Which brings us to a nation in absolute despair.
You see, the psychology of a massive population drastically changes when its core reality is completely shattered. After the crushing humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's national identity was totally broken. And then comes the hyperinflation of 1923. Imagine the sheer, agonizing vulnerability of a society where a single loaf of bread suddenly cost 200 billion marks. 200 billion! Money became completely worthless overnight. Entire life savings just vanished into thin air.
And right when they started to recover, the 1929 Wall Street crash hits, instantly pulling foreign loans right out from under Germany's fragile economy. Unemployment absolutely skyrockets to 6 million people. So the psychological so what here is absolutely vital. Economic devastation plunges the collective psyche of a nation into a desperate, gaping void. When people lose their livelihoods, their pride, and their basic stability, they crave a strong savior to come in and make sense of the chaos.
And into that terrifying void stepped the ultimate illusion of a savior.
But it wasn't just a dictator who stepped up. It was a highly calculated architect of mass manipulation, Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels. Together, Hitler and Goebbels realized a deeply disturbing truth about us, about human nature. As our sources explicitly point out, they knew that words and images were potent devices that could exploit this massive public discontent. They realized a desperate populace can literally be reprogrammed if you can completely control their reality through carefully engineered sights and sounds. This wasn't standard politics anymore. This was a masterclass in psychological warfare, designed to bypass all logic and speak directly to human fear and anger.
To pull this off, Goebbels deployed an insidious modern arsenal. They orchestrated these massive, mesmerizing rallies using theatrical lighting to make their leader look literally godlike. They weaponized brand new technology, microphones and movie cameras to project absolute dominance. They systematically monopolized newspapers and radio broadcasts so they could silence any opposing thought. They produced incredibly vicious propaganda films, like Jude Seuss, specifically to turn Jewish citizens into the ultimate scapegoats for the nation's suffering. And of course, they famously burned quote-unquote un-German books in these terrifying public spectacles, destroying the works of brilliant minds like Einstein, Freud, and Helen Keller. They systematically deleted truth and replaced it with a manufactured myth.
And that level of manipulation rapidly leads to the death of democracy.
The results of relentlessly manipulating public fear and identity were just staggering.
Look at this shift. A political party that won a totally laughable 2.6% of the vote in 1928 absolutely exploded to 37% just 4 years later. Propelled entirely by deep economic anxiety and this primal desire for a strong man, the masses eagerly flocked to the very extreme they used to dismiss as a joke.
And then you witness the ultimate boiling frog effect of authoritarianism. In January 1933, Hitler is named chancellor. Just 2 months later, in March, he uses emergency powers to pass the Enabling Act, literally bypassing Parliament entirely. By June 1934, during the bloody purge known as the Night of the Long Knives, he simply assassinates hundreds of political rivals. And by August, the president dies, the army backs Hitler, and total control is assumed. In less than 2 years, a modern democratic republic was methodically, legally dismantled into a total dictatorship.
But we have to look at the horrifying cost of that obedience.
Because what actually happens when an entire society fully surrenders its morality to a cult of personality? The regime's dark ideology systematically escalated, step by terrifying step. First, they normalize biological segregation, literally stripping Jewish citizens of their basic humanity and citizenship with the Nuremberg Laws in 1935. Then, completely fueled by this concept of Lebensraum or living space, they launch into reckless territorial expansion into Austria and Czechoslovakia. And finally, this completely unchecked megalomania leads to the invasion of Poland, sparking the absolute slaughter of the Second World War and the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust.
But as the war inevitably turned against them, Hitler's raging God complex ended up dooming his own blindly obedient followers. Think about this. When his own armies were freezing, starving, and hopelessly outnumbered in the brutal ruins of Stalingrad, his only response from his safe, distant headquarters was simply, "Surrender is forbidden." The supposed national savior was perfectly willing to let his own people freeze to death rather than admit a single defeat.
The psychological infection ran so incredibly deep that, even as total defeat loomed, it literally morphed into a death cult. In 1944, Goebbels went on radio to demand total war, a completely suicidal national commitment. He actually decreed that if Germany lost the war, the German people were destined to be obliterated. This whole nightmare only came to an end when Soviet troops were literally closing in on Berlin in 1945, and the very leaders who orchestrated this global devastation cowardly took their own lives in a bunker.
Which forces us to look at the echoes of this history.
We have to look at these mechanisms completely neutrally, because the core psychological vulnerabilities of human beings really haven't changed. Our source material for this explainer actually draws a very striking comparison regarding modern populist victories. The sources point out that in 1928 Germany, a fringe extremist with a failed push was widely dismissed as a political joke, only to successfully leverage deep economic despair to win ultimate power. The text then compares this directly to the 2015 United States election, noting that when Donald Trump announced his candidacy, the world initially reacted with laughter, completely dismissing it as a clownish publicity stunt. Yet the sources note that by focusing heavily on immigration and promising a nostalgic return to golden days with Make America Great Again, he won the presidency. The analysis in our provided sources suggests that populations consistently make the exact same fatal psychological error, laughing off radical, scapegoating figures right up until the very moment that underlying economic anxiety propels them to the highest offices in the world.
So, as we stare into the dark mirror of history today, we see the exact same human vulnerabilities looking right back at us. We see the same terrifying potential for media manipulation, the exact same hunger for strong saviors during times of economic despair, and the exact same danger of treating radical rhetoric as mere entertainment. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this one deeply chilling question to sit with. Could it happen again?